Previously, on the last days of World War II, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery successfully crossed the Rhine in a massive operation, only to be upstaged by his rival, US General George Patton. Operation Varsity, the largest airborne assault of the war, landed 22,000 troops across the Rhine. In the Pacific, the US Navy began a series of attacks on Japanese merchant vessels and industrial targets. This week, the Allies are poised for the final push towards Berlin, but the drive to the German capital is complicated by competing strategies and political needs. General Eisenhower faces a crucial decision. In the Pacific, one prolonged and bloody battle ends as another begins. As Iwo Jima is finally secured, US forces, under a barrage of kamikaze attacks, prepare to land on Okinawa. The 25th of March, Allied troops sweep German resistance aside as they push their way into Germany's heartland.
The excitement was that we were on the offensive, and nobody was stopping us. There was no opposition.
You could see by what was happening, you could smell surrender.
Many units gave up, and they would just march down the road, and we just tell them to keep going. Somebody in the rear will take care of you. And they seemed to be happy to do that. There were just thousands and thousands of troops.
These were beaten men. You had 13-year-olds and 65-year-olds, and they were only too happy to stop their fighting and to be taken by the Americans and be fed.
Nobody on the British, American, or Soviet side had the faintest idea how bad conditions were, that the Germans were starving, that there was disease everywhere, because the Germans went on fighting in an organized way to the end, so they assumed that there was food and stuff. There wasn't.
We treated them very humanely. We didn't take any of their food away from them. We didn't take any of their water. And by the way, most of them had schnapps in their canteen rather than water.
As Allied troops storm through German towns east of the Rhine, many civilians also give up, hanging out white flags in the hope that their homes will be spared.
We would go into a town, and there were white linens floating out of every window, and everybody was welcoming us, you know.
But some fanatical resistance does remain, especially amongst SS units. And die-hard Nazis will punish any sign of defeatism with brutal, exemplary punishment.
The most devoted supporters of the Third Reich were not only willing to die with the regime in those last weeks, but were determined to take as many of their own people with them as they could.
As Allied troops weed out German resistance, the final assault on Berlin is more and more on people's minds. As they close in on Germany's capital city, the gifted but egotistic Allied commanders, General George Patton and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, both hope to be in at the death. Despite long-standing differences in style and strategy, Patton and Monty have at least one thing in common: total disagreement with their boss. The rival generals believe that a narrow frontal attack, a single thrust into the heart of the Reich, is the most effective strategy to take Berlin. However, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, prefers a broad front strategy.
The broad front strategy was an attempt to roll up the German front all the way from north to south. In part, this was motivated by military common sense, the desire not to leave significant German forces on one's flanks.
The 25th of March, Eisenhower's next objective in the north is the Ruhr Valley. The British Second Army from the north, Simpson's US 9th Army from the rear, and Hodges' US 1st Army, advancing from the Remagen bridgehead, will encircle the Ruhr.
Our division was assigned with number of others to take that Ruhr pocket. In other words, we had the Germans surrounded, and they fought bitterly for a while until it became obvious that they were going to be defeated there.
German iron, coal and steel factories are all centered in the Ruhr Valley. If it can be isolated, German war production will be crippled, and over 300,000 German troops under the command of Field Marshal Model would be trapped.
The encirclement of the Ruhr pocket meant that really the German force was negated. It did not have any power, any kick, anything to fight back.
By the end of the week, the Ruhr pocket is almost completely encircled. The Allies race almost 200 miles in a week. The 25th of March. As Allied forces tightened the vice on the Ruhr pocket, to the south, General Patton's US Third Army captures the city of Darmstadt. Already devastated by British bombing raids, US infantry mop up pockets of resistance in and around the city. Later that night, Patton makes a controversial and uncharacteristically reckless decision. Patton's aversion to direct assaults has earned him a reputation as not only a brilliant combat leader, but one who is intent on minimizing casualties. But now, Patton orders General William Hogue, commander of the 4th Armored Division, to dash over 50 miles behind enemy lines to free 700 US prisoners of war who are being held at a camp near Hammelburg. Thinking the order overly ambitious, Hogue immediately voices opposition to the mission. Patton now realizes his order will draw the attention of the Allied High Command.
It was a large force. There'd be a lot of hoo-ha about this, and it would have to be discussed at the top level, and Bradley or even Eisenhower would say, "What's going on, George? Why are we sending these guys to this one POW camp to liberate it? What's the strategic objective? Why are we doing this? We're going to liberate them in a matter of days anyway. What's the rush? What's the hurry?"
The 26th of March. Patton decides to assign the mission to a small armored task force led by Captain Abraham J. Baum. 294 men, 53 armored vehicles, half-tracks and jeeps will break through the German front lines.
It was Abraham Baum's mission to take just 300 men. They had only 15 maps. They didn't exactly know where the camp was. They were promised air cover, but it wasn't guaranteed. They had to go behind German lines, liberate 700 POWs, and then come back. They only had enough fuel to get there and come back. They couldn't have any kind of serious diversion. It basically was a suicide mission.
Baum also expressed concern over the order, but for Patton, this mission was personal.
Colonel John Waters was married to Patton's daughter. Patton knew his son-in-law was in this POW camp, and he wanted to get him out and get him home. And that's what he did.
Just before midnight, Baum and his task force set out. By the next morning, they find themselves within a few miles of their objective. But as the task force closes in on the camp, they are suddenly attacked by a German assault gun battalion. The 27th of March. It's been less than 24 hours since Captain Baum's task force received orders from General Patton to attempt to rescue American POWs held at a camp near Hammelburg. At the outskirts of the camp, the column comes under fire, but a brief skirmish is enough to drive off the German guards. After securing the area, Baum is stunned by what he finds within the prison gates.
He got there and looked over this camp, and he saw thousands of emaciated, crying, joyous American POWs running towards him through a break in the wire of this POW camp.
Baum realizes his mission is hopeless.
He knew that he couldn't take them. There were thousands. He had, by now, only about 220 guys with him and a dozen vehicles. He couldn't take 7,000 And Baum has to stand there and say, hey, we're not the front lines. We're a task force. The real front lines are 70 miles that way. And you imagine what these guys, they go from joy to just bewilderment. What the hell are you talking about? You're not the front lines. What are you doing here then, you know?
Baum can only free a small number of prisoners. Patton's son-in-law, Colonel John Waters, is not one of them.
The great irony of this was that Waters was shot by a German guard during the battle to take Hammelburg, but this guy who's the objective of the mission is shot and injured, and there's no way they could take him out anyway.
Now Baum must make the dangerous trip back across German territory to the Allied lines. But the Germans are now fully alert to his presence. The 28th of March, Baum's armoured column runs into trouble outside the village of Hesdorf, 5 miles from the camp. Soon they are surrounded and under attack from German tanks and infantry. Outgunned and outnumbered, Baum tells his men to form small groups and try to get back across the lines. The raiders and the POWs who survived the battle are recaptured. Baum himself is shot in the thigh and forced to surrender. Over the next few days, only 15 Americans make it back to safety. Less than 2 weeks after Baum's ill-fated mission, the camp would be liberated. Those wounded in the Hammelburg raid, including Captain Baum and Patton's son-in-law, Colonel Waters, would be freed by the 14th Armoured Division on the 5th of April. Meanwhile, the bulk of Patton's troops are pushing eastward into the German heartland. The 26th of March, the 6th Armoured Division under the command of General Robert Groh begins their final drive toward Frankfurt. Near the town of Sachsenhausen, they find one of the few bridges still standing across the Main River, but it has been so damaged that it cannot support vehicles. Foot soldiers, however, are able to cross. Faced with the prospect of losing one of their major cities, the Germans mount a ferocious resistance. The US advance is halted by heavy German artillery fire. It's impossible to make the bridge safe for heavy vehicles under such a barrage. Despite the heavy enemy fire, US troops still managed to reach the north bank of the river. 3 days later, Patton's Third Army also reaches Frankfurt. The city is under Allied control by the end of the week. To the south, the US 7th Army, under the command of General Alexander Patch, completes its sweep of the Saar-Palatinate, a huge and vital area of heavy industry south of the Mosel River. Today, it's Patch's turn to cross the Rhine, near the town of Worms. The task of leading the assault is given to forces under the command of General Wade H. Haslip. The attack on Worms is scheduled for 2:30 p.m. US High Command knows that 22 German divisions have already escaped across the Rhine. Nevertheless, they expect minimal resistance. But the Germans mount a vigorous defense. One weapon the American infantry are relying on is the M20 bazooka. The bazooka was a shoulder-mounted US anti-tank rocket launcher.
They used a shaped charge in the form of a rocket, and it became a very effective anti-tank weapon. You could launch this rocket and it could pierce the armor of a tank.
Eisenhower once said the bazooka was one of the weapons crucial to Allied victory in World War II, and outclassed all similar weapons in use at the time. The bazooka fired a warhead on a fin-stabilized rocket. It had an effective range against tanks of about 100 yards.
The weapon was fired by 2 men. One man held it, and the other man loaded it. And once he loaded it, he tapped the gunner on the head and he fired it. Not only can you use the weapon against armor, which was what it was designed to do, but you could also use this weapon against fixed fortifications. And in the Pacific, it's going to become a very effective weapon for going after Japanese in pillboxes, bunkers, and in caves.
As an assistant bazooka man, I never let the fellow who was the bazooka man get very, very far from me. I had a sack under my arm containing 10 rounds for the bazooka ammunition. And as we got to the point where we needed the bazooka, I was to place myself behind him, facing away, so we were back to back. And then as he fired the bazooka, I would reload it for him and tap the wire around the thing and then hit him on the head, let him know it was all set to go again.
When the bazooka was first demonstrated in 1941, the top brass was so impressed, they immediately ordered 5,000. The 26th of March, as Patch's troops crossed the Rhine at Worms, more than half of their assault boats are lost to enemy fire. The US 7th Army, once across the Rhine, faced pockets of resistance in surrounding villages. Before long, Allied air support lends a hand, and the battle for the river crossing at Worms is soon over. 42 US troops are killed, and 150 are wounded in the assault. 2,500 German soldiers surrender. By nightfall, General Bradley's 12th Army Group has established 4 secure bridgeheads across the Rhine. The 1st Army's at Remagen, the 3rd Army's on the Rhine Gorge and at Oppenheim, and the 7th Army's at Worms. The Allied front line now stretches along the Rhine from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Eisenhower's broad front strategy has successfully cleared German territory west of the Rhine, but it has cost precious time. The 26th of March, Berlin. Inside the crumbling German capital, the Nazi regime calls upon the exhausted and demoralized citizens of Germany to resist the Allies by becoming guerrillas, declaring, "Hatred shall be our prayer and revenge our battle cry."
There was an effort on the part of Goebbels to create weapons caches, to create networks that could disseminate information and orders to this group that would be known loosely as the Werewolves.
But despite his efforts, the werewolf program never gets off the ground. Most Germans simply want the war to be over as quickly as possible.
The werewolf organization really never existed. There were, of course, isolated incidents of sabotage after the war. There were murders, there were attacks on American soldiers, but they were so isolated that any effort to really tie them together into a coherent resistance organization is fanciful.
As German civilians suffer in the ravaged streets of Berlin, 50 feet below ground, the atmosphere in Hitler's bunker grows increasingly tense. His remaining henchmen are locked to his side by a sense of duty, loyalty, and even a delusional idea that Hitler's favor is still worth seeking.
Hitler's leadership style encouraged this kind of paranoia, so that one really didn't know where one stood.
By now, Hitler is divorced from reality, and few are brave enough to shatter his illusions. But his words still command obedience.
Up until the very end, as long as Hitler was able to get radio communiques out of the bunker, his orders were followed.
In an attempt to slow the approaching Allies and exact revenge for the relentless bombing of German cities, Hitler launches his weapon of vengeance, the V-2 rocket. For the last 6 months of the war, the V-2 rocket replaced the V-1. Nicknamed the Buzz Bomb, or Doodlebug, the V-1 had been in use since June 1944. Launched from fixed ramps, the 26-foot-long aircraft had a wingspan of 18 feet and carried a warhead which weighed 1,875 pounds. Hitler insisted on a far more powerful and terrifying weapon. German scientists came up with the 46-foot-long V2, which carried a 1-ton warhead.
The V2 was a rocket. It was a ballistic rocket. It subscribed a ballistic trajectory into the target, and there was no warning when it came in.
Flying through the upper atmosphere at up to 3,600 miles per hour with a range of 200 miles, the V2 was unstoppable once launched. Firing sites were mobile and easily concealed, reducing their vulnerability to air attack. The first V2 was launched from Holland on the 8th of September 1944. Due to its incredible speed, it fell only a few minutes later on the leafy residential area of Chiswick in West London, killing 3 people, injuring 17, and destroying 6 homes.
This was something different. Before, the British always had warning. They knew that there was an air raid coming. Radar would pick up the aircraft, the sirens would go off, people would go down into the underground or the shelters, no problem. The first time you knew you were being hit with a V2 is when the raid went off. So it was more of a terror weapon than it was a weapon of military utility.
Churchill believed that deaths resulting from a mass panic would be much greater than those from the attacks themselves. So, as the first V2s began to fall, the British people were told the huge explosions were from gas leaks. Not until November did the government admit that a new terror had been unleashed on Great Britain. In a 6-month period, Germany launched more than 1,000 V2s at England. 517 of them struck London. Hitler's new vengeance weapon killed 2,745 people and injured more than 6,000. The only way to stop a V2 was to destroy the launch platforms on the ground. But because German forces moved the mobile units quite frequently, this proved excruciatingly difficult. The 27th of March, 2 V2s hit London. One hits a block of flats, killing 131 people. But as the Allies forged deeper into Germany, the V2 launchers are forced so far back that England is no longer in range. This attack on Britain would be the last. The 28th of March, as the Western Allies continue their successful advance from the west, the Red Army continues its murderous rampage from the east. As US troops reach Frankfurt, German General Heinz Guderian, Army Chief of Staff, decides that he must be firm and direct with Hitler. Guderian realizes that the war is lost, but he hopes that Germany can still be saved from total destruction. Upon hearing Guderian's grim assessment, a heated argument ensues. Hitler relieves Guderian of his duties, telling him that he isn't physically up to the strain of high command. This is affecting his judgment, Hitler tells him. He is told to return in 6 weeks. Guderian's dismissal throws a blanket of gloom over the German staff. Confused by Hitler's defiance of military logic, they conclude that Hitler is deranged. The 25th of March, the Eastern Front. The Red Army attacks in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The Second Ukrainian Front attacks along the north bank of the Danube River and across the Hron. Germany's ally, Hungary, has been defeated and overrun, and very few of her troops fight on. Soviet forces will reach the Austrian border in just a matter of days. The 27th of March, the 6th SS Panzer Army suffers heavy casualties in intense fighting as it tries to hold the Soviet advance along the Raba River line. The Red Army is fighting a brutal campaign, revenging the many atrocities committed by Germans in the USSR. And they are intent on Berlin.
Germans had killed 22 million Russians, laid waste to the country, and this was a prize the Russians were not going to be denied.
Berlin was the decisive symbol of the Second World War. It was the heart of Hitler's empire, the very focus of Nazi tyranny. And Stalin was absolutely determined that it should be the Soviet Union that had, in his eyes, the glory of capturing it.
The 28th of March. On the Western Front, Allied troops also await the order to drive on Berlin. Eisenhower is acutely aware that his ground forces and their commanders are desperate to reach the German capital first. But Eisenhower does not order an advance.
Simpson wanted the authority to press on to Berlin, to beat the Russians to get there. The Russians were about 70 miles on the other side of Berlin, on the Oder River, and Berlin looked like the big prize. Who didn't want to take Berlin? And Eisenhower said no.
We were stopped. General Simpson, who was the commanding officer of the 9th Army, had ideas that he was going to race to Berlin because he felt he could do it within 24 hours. When he got back to his headquarters, he found out that there was an order from General Eisenhower's headquarters to stop what you're doing and stay where you are.
Eisenhower has decided that the Red Army should take the German capital. He communicates his decision to Stalin on the afternoon of the 28th in a personal message, without consulting his chiefs of staff.
Pre-wartime conferences had already decided that the Berlin and the area around Berlin would go to the Soviets, would be part of the Soviet zone. So expending American lives and American material to capture Berlin simply for some sort of propaganda victory would have been a mistake.
General Bradley estimates that taking Berlin will cost 100,000 Allied casualties. Eisenhower deems that too high a price for what he considers to be a trophy, rather than a strategic priority.
It was not a pleasant opportunity to go to Berlin. Berlin was like having your back to the wall. And this was the last stroke of Nazi Germany. And this was to be defended by snipers and anything else in this town.
Stalin does not trust Eisenhower and orders his marshals to press on with plans to encircle and take the German capital.
It is clear that the battle over Berlin would cost many lives. And since there is another army which does not seem to be interested in sparing the lives of its men and is very interested in occupying Berlin, then Eisenhower and the British are willing to let the Russians do the dirty work and for them, to some extent, to reap the benefits.
The decision has been made. Eisenhower will not order an attack on Berlin. The Western Allies will halt on the Elbe. The 30th of March, Good Friday. To the north, Soviet forces in Poland seize the city of Danzig. The city, where the first shots of the European war were fired, is demolished by bombs and gunfire and then torched. Residents of Danzig and the refugees who crowd the city are raped, beaten, and murdered. The Soviets take 10,000 German prisoners and capture 45 U-boats in the harbor. But Stalin is not at ease. He wants Berlin. He is determined that glory and revenge will be his. Stalin claims that the Western Allies and Germany have come to an arrangement, that the Germans are surrendering in such droves in the West, not out of fear of the Russians, but to create a corridor for the Western Allies to reach Berlin first. Stalin has massed enormous forces on the Oder in readiness for a direct attack on Berlin. Although Eisenhower has told Stalin that he won't try to capture the German capital, the news stuns Stalin, who is viewing the Western Allies with increasing suspicion.
And when Eisenhower signaled to Stalin and told him directly that he had no intention of going to Berlin, Stalin simply didn't believe him, because he couldn't imagine that any general who had any possibility of gaining that great symbolic triumph would forego it.
While Stalin is guarded, Eisenhower's decision and his communications with the Soviet leader have infuriated Churchill. Churchill has made it clear he does not trust Stalin and believes it's crucial to meet up with the Red Army as far east as possible.
Churchill felt that Eisenhower had taken a narrow military view of the situation rather than a larger political one, given the fact that there were all the warning signs of real trouble with the Soviets coming.
In those last months of the war, you had Churchill desperately concerned, alarmed about the loss of Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, all those countries he could see falling under the Soviet hegemony. He'd come to the conclusion that being nice to Stalin was a waste of time, that in the end, the only thing that the Soviets understood was strength and toughness.
Churchill also believes that stopping short of the German capital is a slap in the face to British and American troops. Montgomery is also enraged. The British deride Eisenhower's deference to Stalin, later referring to the incident as "have a go, Joe," the call used by London prostitutes to entice GIs. The 31st of March. Despite his critics, Eisenhower will not be swayed. His decision stands. The Soviets will take Berlin. Later that day, Eisenhower makes a radio broadcast to the German people, urging them to save themselves from further useless sacrifice and loss of life, and calls upon them to surrender. The Supreme Allied Commander sends word to the Kremlin that he is sending his forces south. The 25th of March, the Pacific. US Marines, who have been on the tiny island of Iwo Jima for over a month, drive the Japanese back into the extreme northwest corner, where they still hold 2 usable airfields. Remaining Japanese forces are determined to fight to the last man. They want to teach the Allies the cost of invading Japanese soil. As US Marines close in on the survivors, 200 Japanese soldiers make a suicidal banzai charge. Every last one is killed. The general who leads the attack, Tadamichi Kuribayashi, is believed to be among the dead, but his body is never identified. The 26th of March, US forces finally control the entire island of Iwo Jima. The last act of defiant Japanese resistance has proved futile. The cost to both sides has been staggering. Of the 82,000 US troops who had come ashore in February and March, nearly 7,000 are dead and 18,000 more are wounded. Japanese losses are even more horrific. Only 216 of the 21,000 men defending the island survive. Those who are not killed in action or taken prisoner commit suicide. For their bravery in combat, 27 US Marines are given America's highest award for gallantry, the Medal of Honor. Of all the medals to be won by US Marines during World War II, 1/3 are awarded for actions on Iwo Jima. US Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz would comment, among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Meanwhile, the fighting on Okinawa is just getting underway. Okinawa is the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, about 300 miles southwest of the Japanese mainland. It's also an essential stepping stone on the way to the Japanese home islands. US Navy Task Force 58 launches a series of devastating airstrikes against the island and opens up a ferocious naval bombardment. These attacks are designed to pave the way for an amphibious landing, scheduled for the 1st of April, just 1 week away. Under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima, one of Japan's ablest commanders, 100,000 troops of the 32nd Army are preparing to defend the island. General Ushijima holds no illusions. The struggle will be ferocious and to the death.
General Ushijima, the commander of the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, was a soft-spoken man, but he radiated a quiet competence that inspired the devotion and loyalty of his subordinates. He's also a smart tactician. He realizes that he's got an island 60 miles long to defend with about 100,000 troops. He can't defend all of it.
Ushijima prepares his defense. at sea, submarines launched unsuccessful attacks against US warships. Determined to fight on and willing to die, the Japanese have resorted to suicide plane attacks. Any pilot who volunteers to become a kamikaze, meaning divine wind, will earn himself an honorable death. Ushijima has 2,000 such volunteers at his disposal in the defense of Okinawa.
It just must have been hellish for the American sailors offshore. 5,000, at least 5,000 American sailors will die during the Okinawa campaign.
They weren't throwing kisses at us, they were throwing airplanes and bombs at us. I didn't even know the word kamikaze. Divine wind, I didn't see anything divine about it.
If there was ever anything that was going to crack a person's psyche and crack his ability to carry on, it was a kamikaze.
I couldn't understand why they were doing this. And to this date, I have a hard time understanding how a person could do that.
They take a heavy toll on the U.S. Navy. At Okinawa, kamikazes will sink about 30 warships, and they'll damage about 360 more. The Americans will lose more ships at Okinawa than they lost at Pearl Harbor, which was a naval disaster.
The 26th of March, the Japanese unleash a relentless wave of kamikaze attacks and hit 8 U.S. ships. The battleship Nevada, light cruiser Biloxi, and 6 other smaller warships are damaged. US carrier-based planes bomb and strafe airfields on Kyushu, Japan's southernmost island, in an attempt to prevent further kamikaze attacks. The US 77th Infantry Division, commanded by General Andrew Bruce, storms the beaches of the Kurama Islands off the southwest coast of Okinawa. Bruce's forces aim to establish a supply and repair base for ships taking part in the invasion of Okinawa. US troops also land on the neighboring island of Tokashiki. The terrified Japanese civilians have been told by their government that the Americans are barbaric and bestial. They have been told that the Americans will slaughter them all without mercy. Frightened and desperate, some take tragic and extreme measures to escape a cruel and degrading death.
The first person we killed was our mother, who gave us life. Everything around me, including my mind, was in absolute chaos. I don't remember the details. But what I do remember is that we first tried to tie her neck with rope. Finally, we took a stone and bashed in her head. That's the brutal thing we did to our mother. I was only 16, and I couldn't stop crying because of the sadness that I had never experienced before. I will never cry in my life like that again.
The 28th of March. In the Ryukyus, the British Pacific Fleet joins the action, commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings. Counterattacks by Japanese explosive boats and submarines fail. The 30th of March. 2 days later, as the strikes on Okinawa continue, the Japanese hit back with waves of kamikaze attacks. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis is badly damaged, but still Allied ships close in on the island.
The naval force that the Allies, mainly the United States, gathered to attack Okinawa was one of the hugest armadas, probably the hugest armada in human history, more than 1,400 ships. There were 40 American aircraft carriers, fleet carriers, and light carriers with about 1,000 aircraft.
As far as the eye could see, that's all you saw were ships. It seemed there must have been 1,000 ships there. And my goodness, we We just couldn't imagine what we were going to face at that point.
By the 31st of March, 50,000 American troops are ready to begin Operation Iceberg, the amphibious landings on Okinawa. It would prove to be one of the bloodiest and most hard-fought campaigns of the entire war.
They're closing in on the Japanese home islands and hoping to set things up for the defeat of Japan, which they expect will have to be accomplished through an invasion of the home islands themselves.
Next, on the last days of World War II, Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, begins. As US forces mount a massive offensive to capture the island, Japanese officials spread propaganda among the civilian population.
Japanese authorities tell them that when the Americans come ashore, they'll murder them, they'll rape their women, they'll barbecue and eat their children.
And the kamikaze attacks continue in a bid to drive off the Allied warships.
Nobody told us, but I mean, you know, you just knew that after Okinawa was going to be Japan itself.